Great, with the fuzzy friends. How are we doing this morning? It's cold. Are we adjusted to this 9:30 thing yet? I feel like some of us are it's a little early. Maybe you're still a little cold, haven't gotten our bodies quite warmed up yet. And some of us have been up for 5 hours. We're on our fourth cup of coffee. It's a big change. There's a lot of change going on around here. You've seen those businesses that have it's been so many days since an accident poster. I feel like when you went on that back wall, that just says it's been 29 days since our head pastor. There's a lot of newness going on. And I was thinking about that this week. And as I was reading this passage, I was reminded of something I learned a while ago, because the Beatitudes is, obviously, it's a famous passage. We've heard how many sermons on it, and it's powerful and it's hopeful. But I was reminded this week, in the midst of all this newness, that there's actually a theme of newness that is running behind the Beatitudes. In fact, there's some really key thematic work that's being done in this passage. And to us, in the 21st century, reading the Bible in English, it might be tough to pick up on, but the early readers, Matthew's early audience, the first century Jews, they would have seen what's going on quite clearly. And what's happening here is that Matthew's establishing one of the key themes for his gospel, which is that Jesus is set up as the new Moses. That's a big deal to an early Jewish reader. Let's think about that for a second. It's in Matthew's gospel only that we see the baby Jesus threatened by King Herod, just like baby Moses was threatened by Pharaoh. And then Jesus has to flee, and he goes down into Egypt with his family, which means that a few years later, just like Moses did, Jesus has to come up out of Egypt. And just before the gospel passage that we have today, Jesus actually goes off into the wilderness for 40 days. And I'm preaching on this story next month, so I won't go into it. But just like Moses went off and fasted for 40 days before he went up to the mountain to receive the law on Mount Sinai in the Old Testament. And then, at the start of our gospel story today, it says that Jesus went up on the mountain. When I read that, these are the things that I do. I was like, went up on the mountain? What mountain? So I went back and looked. I was like, they must have already referenced a mountain that we're supposed to know about. They're trying to point us to a place. There's no mention of one. So they must not be trying to point us to a specific mountain. So I was like, what's going on here? And I looked into it. I realized that if we go back and we look in the original languages, we'll actually learn that when it says Jesus went up on the mountain, it's quoting a passage from Exodus, the very passage where it said that Moses went up on the mountain. And then Jesus launches into this sermon on the mount, where just like Moses, generations and generations before him stood on the side of the mountain and delivered the law to the Israelite people, Jesus now sits on the side of a mountain and is delivering the new law. The early readers would have seen this. They would have known what was going on. This is a big deal for someone to be painted like the new Moses. But Jesus isn't just painted as the new Moses in Matthew's gospel. And I think it's really good for us to know this, because as Pastor Terry said, we're going to read a lot of Matthew this year. Because Moses, he did a lot of great things. He went, into Egypt. He was a leader. They led them out in the Exodus through the 10 plagues, parted the Red Seas. There were miracles in the desert. But what we don't talk about a lot is Moses' story had a bit of a sour ending. You see, we hear a lot about 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, right? Well, if you go and you look at the geography of things, from the Red Sea to the land that we know is the land of Canaan that they were looking at, should have taken about a 2-week walk. So what's going on? Why did it take 40 years to do a 2-week walk? Well, we know that it probably took a year or two for them to do the actual traveling part of it. I mean, there were a lot of different stops along the way, a lot of lessons to be learned. You're moving a lot of people, so you probably have to stop and set up camp a lot. There was a whole manna falling from the sky thing. There was a whole lot going on in that time. But eventually, after only a year or two, they reached the land, the edge of the promised land. And Moses said, here we are, I've got an idea. Let's send in 12 spies. So he takes 12 men and he sends them in to go check out the land and scout it out for them. And those 12 men go in and they come back with a report. They say to Moses and the people of Israel, they say, this land is awesome, just like God said it would be. It's flowing with milk and honey, except there is a problem. The people there are huge. They're strong. Their cities are powerful. These people are like giants. They're almost like gods. We don't stand a chance at defeating them. When this news was delivered, the Israelites freaked out. They imploded. They started crying out, saying, God, why would you deliver us from Egypt only to bring us here so we can die? Some of them asked to go back. Like at least in Egypt, they wanted to keep us alive as slaves so we could work. God was not very happy about this. In fact, in the story, Moses has to actually calm God down and convince God not to kill them all in that moment. Yeah. But God agrees, but it comes with a condition. And the condition, he says, is that an entire generation is going to pass before we get to go into that land. 40 years. In the Bible, that number 40 is really significant, and oftentimes it symbolizes an entire generation. In Joshua, we have a quote which says, the Israelites had moved about in the wilderness for 40 years until all the men who were of military age, when they left Egypt, had died since they hadn't obeyed the Lord. Those are all the people that should have been willing to go in and fight, go in and claim the land that God said they could have, and they didn't. So they waited for 38 more years for an entire new generation. And Moses, too, as their leader, didn't end up seeing the promised land. There's this story where they're sitting out in the wilderness waiting, and they're thirsty. So the people come to Moses and say, give us water. And Moses goes to God and says, can we have some water? And God says, sure, go talk to this rock and water's going to come out. Moses goes, finds this rock in front of the people, and instead of speaking to the rock like God said, he strikes the rock with his staff. And Moses was used to doing things with his staff. We picture him holding it up above the Red Sea and parting it. We know he stuck it in the ground with the serpent on it to cure the disease in the desert. Moses was used to that, so he just hit the rock with his staff. But what this story is a symbol of how Moses wasn't trusting God's power. He was trusting his own. Just like when instead of trusting that God will take us into the promised land, he sent in the 12 spies to make sure we could do it. It was a sign of lack of trust. And Moses, in the end, didn't get to see the promised land either. He ended up sitting outside in the wilderness, waiting for the next generation to rise up and go inside. God is always calling us forward. Stagnation isn't part of God's playbook. And when we talk about Jesus as the new Moses, this is something he takes very seriously. Jesus is always calling us forward, and he started this in his ministry, like we're reading about today. The Jews that he was talking to, the Jews that Jesus was teaching, they were a very traditional people. And Jesus had a knowledge of this tradition. He had a sense of belief in it. It was his own tradition. He had a deep respect for the tradition. But what he didn't show is an allegiance to the tradition. Right after what we read in our gospel today in the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the next couple weeks, he launches into this part of the sermon where he says, you have heard it said this, but I say this. Sometimes the rules that were governing the Jews at this time weren't good enough for Jesus, like about not murdering. He said, you have heard it said, whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the courts, but I say that anyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. Other times, Jesus refuted the rules completely. He said, you may have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say we need to turn the other cheek. In Matthew 12, Jesus fights with the Pharisees over the rules of the Sabbath. There's this story where the disciples are walking through these fields of grain, and they're picking the heads of the grain, and they're eating it on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees pop up out of nowhere, and they say, hey, you're not supposed to do that. And they knew this. The disciples, Jesus, they knew the rules. They know that the Sabbath, you're supposed to prepare your food the day beforehand. That's how you keep it. But Jesus basically goes to the Pharisees like, what's going on, you guys? You are completely missing the point of the rules. People have to eat. This is not what this is all about. And isn't a standalone incident either. Jesus clashes in the Gospel of Matthew a lot, and especially with the Pharisees. In fact, Jesus and the disciples break the rules a lot. They don't wash their hands before they eat like they're supposed to. They don't fast when they're expected to, and they touch people that they're not supposed to touch. So why is Jesus such a rule breaker? What's going on? Well, like Moses, Jesus had a mission. Jesus was trying to lead a new exodus. He's trying to take people out of something and into something new. And he saw that the way they were dealing with the rules, the law, it was holding them back. It's been 4 Sundays now without Pastor Mark. I miss him. I know that after he announced his retirement, we launch into this whole congregational horizon process, which is powerful and beautiful, and it's why we're all here together right now. And I tell you what, even if I don't get a chance to make second service revisions to my sermon, I love having you all here at the same time. It's great. And in those last few months of having Pastor Mark with us here at St. Andrew, we had lots of conversations about the future of the church and where things were headed and where God was calling us. And he knew that there were big things ahead, big changes ahead, cool things. And he always encouraged me with a few different things. One, of course, being the good Lutheran he is, he'd always bring in Luther, and he would just encourage me to be courageous. He would say, sin boldly. Whatever you try, sin boldly. And then he would also, of course, bring in Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he would talk about acting faithfully. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he talked about acting faithfully, he would say, we have to make a decision. We have to make a lot of decisions in life. We think about all of the circumstances. We think about the parties to which we are responsible. And at the end, we have to just do our best sometimes and make a choice. And when we make that choice, we then have to act in that choice faithfully. And to do that, Dietrich would have said, and Mark would have said, is to trust God. And trust God to literally judge our actions. And when he talked about judgment, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't talking about pearly gates or flames, but what he was talking about is the reality that God will carry forward that which needs to be carried forward, and he will let fall away what needs to fall away. So, question for us, St. Andrew, as we enter in this season of newness, this liminal space, is what is the promised land? What are we being called to step into? In fact, maybe it's not a promised land, but I think Jesus was leading people more into a promised way of living. What are we being called to do? It's probably scary. In fact, if it isn't, we're doing something wrong. It's going to feel like we have to go conquer some giants. But the good news is we have a strong foundation. We have Micah 6:8. One of our passages today reminding us to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly. That's a strong foundation. We have reminders in the Beatitudes of the special place that God has, the special affection for the poor, the gentle, the peacemakers of the world. And when the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness on their way to the eventual promised land, they carried with them the law from Moses. They carried it in the Ark of the Covenant everywhere they went. And we have those things too. We have these cores, these foundations of what make us St. Andrew, of what makes it such a beautiful place, what makes it such a powerful faith. These are core things that we will get to take with us too, no matter where we go, all together. So may we walk forward into this newness with humility and courage together. Amen.